So I think that the political dynamic here is the hyperinflation and the rampant inflation in the non-Western European, US developed world is actually a massive, aggressive catalyst for Bitcoin adoption.
Welcome to Dream Richer. Inflation is on the rise and its drastic effects are yet to be seen. Many believe that Bitcoin will become a global currency to ultimately save us from inflation. Such worldwide adoption is the only scenario in which we could see Bitcoin hit insane prices, or even hit infinity. According to Saylor, that dream is right around the corner. But there are different factors that will lead the adoption of Bitcoin in developed countries versus the developing countries. It may come as a surprise to many, but developing worlds with the highest inflation rates currently have the highest amounts of crypto users compared to users in developed country. In fact, USA only accounts for 6% of crypto users, whereas Nigeria has the highest number of crypto users, sitting at 32%, followed by Vietnam, Philippines, and Turkey. Nigeria, which currently holds the most crypto users, has one of the weakest economies, with the Nigerian naira oftentimes being called a currency with no value. According to the deputy governor of Nigeria, the depreciation in their economy should be attributed to the effects of the corona pandemic. Do you think developing countries will be the leaders in Bitcoin adoption? If you find the video helpful, then don't forget to subscribe. Let's get right into it.
Developed world versus developing world. What do you see as the political drivers in the developing world versus developed with regard to Bitcoin?
Well, in the developing world, it's interesting because if you look, NYDIG and others, they've shown, I think Chainalysis did this. NYDIG had it in one of their reports showing the level of adoption in different countries, and generally you see that some of the higher inflation developing countries have some of the highest levels of Bitcoin adoption, which shouldn't be that surprising. We were talking about inflation being at 7% while yields are at 0%. And that's one of the better currencies out there, the dollar. So imagine if you're in an environment where you're underbanked or unbanked, and you're dealing with double-digit currency inflation, but you have a mobile phone, as over 4 billion people have now, and so they can hold Bitcoin, for example, and for them, obviously they're still dealing with the volatility of Bitcoin. But they have a stronger incentive to latch on to that type of property, I think, than it's more apparent to them. It's quicker hitting them than it does in some of the developed markets that I think they feel they have. It's less kind of in their face, some of the challenges that people are facing in those countries. Obviously, you have some countries ban it, but the majority of them, their main question is, how do we regulate it? How do we protect people? How do we incorporate it? How do we make sure that our industries are not left behind and our public's not left behind?
If you live in Argentina or Venezuela or Zimbabwe or if you live through a currency collapse, you realize that the currency is exposed, the sovereign debt is exposed, right? Those countries default on their sovereign debt all the time. Argentina, in essence, renegotiated $50 billion of sovereign debt a week ago. So they're always defaulting on debt, but it turns out that if you have all your assets in a local business or local stocks, those get crushed too when the currency collapses, because their revenues and cash flows are in the local currency. So if you've got a 50% inflation rate, the cost of not embracing Bitcoin is 50% of your assets would be lost to you, or 50% of your currency derivatives in 12 months. So the cost of doing nothing, the hurdle rate or the risk rate is 50, 60, 70, or 100% in those environments. So I think that the political dynamic here is the hyperinflation and the rampant inflation in the non-Western European, US developed world is actually a massive, aggressive catalyst for Bitcoin adoption. That it's not going to stop right anytime soon. And this is the first currency crisis where Bitcoin existed a decade ago, and every other currency collapse right in the developed developing world, they never had a Bitcoin. So
El Salvador has already led the way in countries adopting Bitcoin. But according to some, Bitcoin news may not be an effective means of freedom unless corruption within developing worlds is taken care of first. For example, the president of El Salvador marketed Bitcoin as a way for Salvadorans to save hundreds of millions of dollars lost in fees each year, as many rely on payments sent from family members working abroad. But only around 2.1% of remittances have been sent in cryptocurrencies since the Bitcoin law came into effect. Bitcoin could have banked the unbanked and limited the power of bloated banks and authoritarian governments. But according to a resident of El Salvador, the government is using Bitcoin to gain control. In El Salvador, it's a black box, he says. The government appears to be the real holders of the Bitcoin held in Chivo wallets and is offering little transparency.
we don't really have any experience with what happens, except that we have anecdotal evidence to suggest that in Nigeria and Venezuela and Argentina and Turkey, people are getting sophisticated, crypto sophisticated at a pretty rapid rate. And we know the two things they like. The one thing they want is they want US dollar stablecoin. We went from 30 billion to $150 billion of stablecoin in 12 months. So we know they want that, right? They want to go from weak currency to strong. And the second thing they want is they want to go from weak property to strong property. And the strongest property would be Bitcoin. I hear that you can't actually own land in China. You can have a 70-year lease on land, or so you're leasing everything at the pleasure of the government, or you have your business, you have your land, you have your property at the pleasure of the government. Now, if the Chinese and that entire regime dismisses digital property, presumably that's going to hold back their economic growth over the next 100 years. And I suspect that if you look at the 8 billion people on the planet, everybody wants dollars, even everybody in China. I bet you that in China, the 2 billion people in that sphere of influence, they would also take stable USD. And the way we know this, actually, the acid test is the fact that the Chinese have capital controls. And if they drop the capital controls, the CNY would go awry and huge amounts of capital would flow out of their country, right? That you wouldn't have to fight to keep people from transferring capital if they didn't want to.
And I think that's another thing that politicians are seeing is that, you generally don't want to fight the demographics trend as it relates to any sort of political topic. And so if you look at the percentages of what each generation owns, the percentage of say whether or not they own Bitcoin or digital assets, the numbers go up the younger you get as you segment the population. And so politicians, unless they want to shoot themselves in the foot, they wouldn't really fight that trend. And so I think that that's an important kind of observation going forward.
Watching the policy of the more progressive nations, Singapore, UAE, they'll be leaders in this. Normally they are leaders in free market, financial, technology innovation. I would expect the UAE, given its track record, they pride themselves on being very forward-thinking, mobile, internet savvy. I think that you might see some kind of clear guidance from them. And of course, the 800-pound gorilla is what happens on Capitol Hill in the United States with regard to this. But I think we can look forward to a lot more political conversations that include discussion of Bitcoin, and by inference and by implication, they're all accelerating the adoption of the asset class.
It's clear from Michael Saylor that Bitcoin is the only viable solution to the inflation that is coming. Inflation is simply more than the devaluing of the currency. It's about your rights and power, which are the two fundamental components of a democratic society. Suppose that the government wants to buy a $20,000 van for the post office. The honest way to go about this is to use $20,000 of tax revenues to buy a van. But a sneakier way is to print $20,000 in new cash to buy the van. By printing and spending the new cash, the government has converted $20,000 of private property, which is the van in this case, into public property. So printing new cash works just like a tax. Because printing new money ends up causing inflation, this type of taxation is often referred to as an inflation tax. Hence, Every time the feds print money behind closed doors, they tax you, which some may argue is against our rights and freedom. Do you agree that Bitcoin is the only viable solution to all this? To learn more about the latest crypto news, watch these videos here.